"I am pregnant and too fat to love, sir." "But I can cook," said the settler woman to the giant rancher. A heavily pregnant settler woman, ostracized for her size, finds refuge and purpose as the cook for a reclusive, mute giant, forging a silent family in the wilderness that is threatened by the very society that cast them both out. The prairie wind was a constant, scraping whisper against the endless grass, a sound that had worn Elara down over days of travel until it felt like it was scouring the inside of her skull. She was a speck on the vast, tan canvas of the plains, huddled in the back of a wagon that groaned with every turn of its wheels like a dying man. Each jolt sent a shock through her, a painful reminder of the life she carried and the precariousness of her own. Her hands, raw and chapped from sun and cold, were splayed over the hard, prominent dome of her belly. A shield. A plea. The driver, a grizzled man whose name she never learned and whose face seemed carved from the same bitter wood as his wagon seat, hadn't spoken for hours. He was just a silhouette against the bleached sky, a harbinger of the isolation to which he was delivering her. "Almost there," he grunted, the sound startling in the silence. "Orson's place. Last stop." "You sure about this, girl?" Elara didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the mountains in the distance, a jagged purple fortress that seemed to swallow the horizon. They were not welcoming. They were a final barrier. "I'm sure," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. Her certainty was a fragile thing, a thin pane of glass over a chasm of fear. A memory, sharp and unbidden, sliced through her, the slam of a door in a sun-bleached town street. A woman's face, peering from a bonnet, eyes like flint as they dropped from Elara's face to her swollen belly, then away in disgust. The voice of the preacher, not offering salvation but condemnation. "Your transgression is plain for all to see, child. You must atone." The words had been a physical weight pushing her out, pushing her here. The wagon creaked to a halt. Dust plumed around them, settling slowly like a shroud. Before them stood a gate. It was not built for men but for myths. Massive logs, stripped of bark and lashed together with iron bands as thick as her arm, formed a barrier that looked less like an entrance and more like the jaw of some great wooden beast. Beyond it, a track led towards a cluster of buildings whose scale, even at a distance, was disorienting. "This is it," the driver said, his voice flat. "The giant's ranch. He don't much like visitors." He jerked a thumb, the universal sign for, "Get out." Elara moved awkwardly, her body heavy and foreign to her. Her feet hit the hard earth and the world swayed. She reached for her sack, her only possession in the world. The driver didn't hand it to her. He looked down, and in his eyes was not malice, but a kind of weary pity that was somehow worse. "Look, girl. I took you this far out of the goodness of my heart. But that's it. There ain't no coming back. You understand? You make your bed here or you don't make one at all." He dropped the sack. It landed in the dust with a soft, final thud. Then he snapped the reins. The wagon lurched, turned, and began to recede, the sound of its groaning wheels growing fainter until it was swallowed by the immense, crushing silence. She was alone. The silence was a presence. It pressed in on her ears, heavier than the wind, more terrifying than the judgment of 100 towns. She stared at the gate, a monument to her desperation. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to chase the fading dust cloud of the wagon, to beg for a return to a world that had already spat her out. Then, a movement from within, a strong, insistent kick against the wall of her womb. A life demanding its chance. It was the only answer she needed. Bending was a slow, deliberate agony. She retrieved her sack, dusted it off, and straightened her shoulders. She approached the gate and pushed. It groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. It swung inward just enough for her to slip through. The world inside was built for a different species. The fence posts of the corral came up to her chin. The water trough was a hollowed-out log large enough to bathe a horse. And the house. The house was a fortress of timber, 2 stories of raw, unvarnished logs, with a porch that seemed as wide as the prairie itself. It was a place of stark function, built not for comfort but for endurance. The walk to the front door was a pilgrimage. Each step was a battle against the voice in her head that whispered of foolishness, of recklessness. She reached the porch steps, each one the height of a small stool, and climbed them, one hand clamped on the rough rail, the other cradling her child. She stood before the door. It was solid, unadorned, a slab of wood that could have withstood a battering ram. There was no knocker. She balled her fist, the skin stretched tight over her knuckles, and knocked. The sound was a tiny hollow tap, swallowed by the sheer mass of the door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder, the sound echoing faintly in the void beyond. Thump. Thump. Footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of a normal man, but the slow, deliberate impacts of a great weight, each one a tremor that vibrated up through the porch boards and into the soles of her feet. The door swung inward. He filled the doorway, blotting out the light from within. Orson was not merely tall. He was a geography of a man. Shoulders like mountain ledges strained the fabric of his homespun shirt. A thick, wild beard covered the lower part of his face, but it could not conceal the weather-beaten lines of his skin or the startling, clear blue of his eyes. They held a deep, quiet intelligence, and they were fixed on her. He did not speak. He did not need to. His mere presence was a question, a challenge. Elara's breath caught. She took a half-step back, the old shame rising in her throat, hot and bitter. She saw herself through his eyes, a bedraggled, oversized woman, soiled by travel and swollen with a child that had no father. A problem. A mess. The words she had rehearsed, the pathetic currency she had to offer, tumbled out in a desperate, breathless rush. Sir. I saw your notice. In town. For a cook. His silence was a wall. His gaze, heavy and assessing, drifted down to her belly and stayed there. I know what you see, she pleaded, her voice trembling as she used the town's poison as her own shield. I am pregnant and too fat to love, sir. The words tasted like ash. She forced them out. They were all she had. But I can cook. I can. My biscuits are light. My stew could warm a corpse. I need the work. I'll ask for nothing more. Her voice broke on the last word. She had laid herself bare, every flaw, every desperation, offered up for his judgment. Orson's eyes left her belly and returned to her face. He did not look at her body with disgust, but at her soul with a profound, resonant understanding. He saw the exhaustion, the crumbling pride, the fierce, desperate love for the child she carried. The giant did not speak. He did not smile. With a grace that belied his colossal frame, he took a single, slow step backward. Then another. He moved to the side, clearing the doorway. It was not a welcome. It was not a kindness. It was simply an opening. A space made for her in the void. Trembling, her legs barely holding her, Elara stepped over the threshold, crossing from a world that had rejected her into a silence that for the first time felt like it might hold a promise. The door closed behind Elara with a soft, definitive thud, sealing her into the dim, cavernous interior. The world outside, the wind, the vast, judging sky, was suddenly gone, replaced by a silence so profound it rang in her ears. It was the silence of a place unused to voices, a silence built of solitude and sheer, massive space. Orson moved past her, his footsteps making the wide planked floorboards groan. He did not look at her again, but his lack of dismissal felt, in that moment, like a form of acceptance. He simply pointed a thick, calloused finger towards a small, normal-sized door set into the far wall of the great room, then turned and disappeared through another doorway, leaving her alone. Elara approached the indicated door and pushed it open. The room within was simple to the point of austerity. A narrow bed with a rough wool blanket, a small washstand with a chipped porcelain pitcher and bowl, and a single square window looking out over the back of the property towards the brooding mountains. It was clean, but it held no personality. It was a cell for a transient, not a home. But it had a door. And a lock. She slid the bolt across. The sound of the metal engaging was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. For the first time in months she was in a room by herself, behind a locked door. No leering eyes, no whispered judgments, no fear of what the next day might bring. The tension that had been coiled in her shoulders, so constant she had forgotten it was there, began to unspool. She sat on the edge of the bed, the straw ticking crunching softly beneath her weight. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the sturdy, living kick of her child. And then the tears came. Not the desperate, silent sobs of the wagon, but a slow, hot, cleansing flood. They were tears of relief, of sheer, unadulterated exhaustion, of the terrifying, fragile hope that had begun to flicker in the darkness. She cried until her head throbbed and her eyes were raw, and then spent, she lay down on the bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Extra ranch house morning. The dawn came not with a rooster's crow, but with a pale, gray light filtering through the small window. Elara woke with a start, the unfamiliar surroundings taking a moment to register. The fear returned in a quick, cold rush. Had it been a dream? But was just as quickly soothed by the solid reality of the four walls around her. She rose, washed her face with the cold water from the pitcher, and straightened her dress. Taking a deep breath, she unbolted her door and stepped back into the main room. In the daylight it was even more imposing. The ceiling was lost in shadows, supported by beams as thick as tree trunks. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth large enough to roast an entire pig. The furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a large rocking chair, was all built to a scale that made her feel like a child. Everything was sturdy, clean, and utterly devoid of warmth. There were no curtains, no rugs, no pictures on the walls. It was the dwelling of a man who ate, slept, and worked here but did not live here. She found the kitchen area, a section of the great room defined by a massive cast-iron stove, a dry sink, and shelves of provisions. It was here she would make her stand. She explored with a cook's practiced eye. There was a sack of flour, another of beans, a side of salt pork wrapped in cloth, a crock of lard, a small cache of potatoes starting to sprout eyes, and a precious, half-empty jar of honey. It was the larder of a man who valued sustenance over flavor. This she could work with. She built a fire in the belly of the great stove, learning its quirks, feeling its heat begin to permeate the room's morning chill. She found a bowl and set to work, measuring flour, salt, a spoonful of precious lard, a pinch of salt. Her hands, which had felt so clumsy and raw the day before, remembered their purpose. The motions of kneading dough were a meditation, a familiar prayer in an unfamiliar land. Orson entered as she was cutting the biscuits. He moved so quietly for his size that she didn't hear him until he was there, a large, still presence watching her from the doorway to the main room. She started, her hand flying to her chest. He didn't react, merely watched as she placed the pan of biscuits into the oven. His eyes followed her every move, the way she wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, the way she set a pot of coffee to boil on the stovetop, the efficient, purposeful way she moved in his space, her space now. The silence stretched, but it was different from the day before. It was no longer a void of judgment, but a canvas. When the biscuits were golden and the coffee was brewed, she prepared 2 plates. She placed one, with 3 biscuits and a mug of coffee, at the head of the massive table, his place. She took her own plate, with a single biscuit, to the far end. Orson approached the table. He looked from the plate to her, a flicker of something unreadable in his blue eyes. He sat. The chair protested under his weight. He picked up a biscuit. It looked comically small in his enormous hand. He broke it in half. Steam, fragrant and warm, curled into the air. He took a bite. He chewed slowly. He did not look at her, but stared at the biscuit in his hand as if it were a profound and mysterious artifact. He finished the first one, then the second. He ate the third more slowly, savoring it. He took a long swallow of coffee. Then he did something she would never forget. He looked up from his plate, directly at her. His beard hid his mouth, but the skin around his eyes crinkled. A slow, deep smile had spread across his face, and it reached his eyes, transforming them from chips of ice to warm, sunlit lakes. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated pleasure. He nodded. A single, grave, and undeniable dip of his chin. The treaty was sealed. Not with words, but with warm bread and a silent smile. She had offered the only thing she had of value, and he had accepted it. In that moment, Elara knew she had not just found a job. She had, against all odds, found a place. The silent treaty forged over biscuits and coffee became the foundation upon which a new, unspoken language was built. The ranch, once a monument to stark isolation, began to breathe. Elara's first week was a study in quiet observation. She learned the rhythms of Orson's world. He rose before the sun, his heavy tread on the porch a more reliable clock than any rooster. She would hear the deep, resonant thunk of him splitting wood, a sound that shook the morning quietude, and she would rise herself to stoke the stove, to measure the oats, to begin the day's work. Her domain was the kitchen, and she set about conquering it. She scrubbed the shelves until the wood grain showed pale and clean. She organized the larder, her fingers brushing against the rough sacks of flour and beans, taking inventory not just of food but of possibility. She found a neglected patch of herbs gone to seed near the well, the ghost of a garden, perhaps planted by a hand long still. She didn't ask. She simply began to weed it, her back aching, the sun warm on her neck. One afternoon, a sudden sharp plink echoed through the main room, followed by the steady patter of rain. A leak. She looked up to see a dark stain spreading on the ceiling, a single drop of water forming, swelling, and falling to land with another plink on the floorboards. She found a pot to place beneath it, the sound now a dull, rhythmic ping. Orson came in for supper, his beard glittering with droplets. His eyes went immediately to the pot, then followed her gaze to the ceiling. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The next day she heard him on the roof, his movements heavy but sure. The pattering of the rain was joined by the scrape of wood and the solid hammering of nails. By evening the ping had ceased. He had fixed a problem she had only pointed to with her eyes. That was their first true conversation. Their exchanges became a daily dialogue of action and attention. She noticed the shoulder seam of his favorite work shirt was fraying, stretched taut by the sheer breadth of him. That evening, by the light of the kerosene lamp, she took out her needle and thread. She didn't ask for the shirt, she simply waited for him to change for the evening, then picked it up from where he'd left it draped over a chair. He watched her, his big body still in the rocking chair, as her needle flew in and out of the thick fabric, reinforcing the seam with tiny, sturdy stitches. When she handed it back to him the next morning, he ran a thumb over the neat work, his expression one of quiet wonder. It was a care he had not known in years. His replies were just as eloquent. He began returning from his chores not just for meals, but with small offerings. One day, it was a clutch of wildflowers, blue flax and prairie coneflower, roots still clumped with dark earth, presented in his huge dirt-caked hand. He held them out awkwardly like a boy unsure of his gift. She took them, her heart performing a strange, soft flutter, and placed them in a jar of water on the table. The splash of color against the dark wood was a revolution. Another time, she had been struggling to carry 2 heavy buckets of water from the well back to the house, stopping every few feet to catch her breath, the weight pulling cruelly at her back and belly. She hadn't known he was watching. Suddenly, his shadow fell over her. He didn't speak, didn't take the buckets from her hands. Instead, he simply lifted the yoke from her shoulders, his hands brushing against hers for a fleeting, electric moment. He carried the buckets to the house, filled the large washtub she used for cleaning, and then, without a word, went back outside and filled every available container. Jugs, pots, the kettle, until the kitchen was stocked with enough water for 2 days. But the most profound conversation began one evening as she sat by the fire, knitting a tiny woolen sock. He was at the table, a block of pine and his whittling knife in his hands. She assumed he was carving a new peg or a tool handle. The shavings curled away from his blade, pale and fragrant, piling on the floor like snow. He worked with a startling delicacy, his massive fingers guiding the knife with the precision of a watchmaker. Days passed. The block of wood took shape, becoming round, then hollowed. He sanded it for an entire evening, until it was as smooth as river stone. The next morning, as she was clearing away the breakfast plates, she found it sitting on her cutting board. It was a rattle. A perfect, tiny wooden rattle. He had drilled small holes and placed dried peas inside, so it made a soft, maraca-like whisper when shaken. He had even sanded a small handle, just the right size for an infant's grip. Elara picked it up. The wood was silken under her touch. She looked across the room to where he stood, pretending to examine a harness. She shook it gently. The soft shush 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 was the first sound made solely for the child who was coming, a promise of welcome. That night, a different storm gathered outside, not of rain but of wind howling down from the mountains like a pack of wolves. The fire spat and crackled in the hearth. Orson was mending a bridle, the leather dark and supple in his hands. Elara, the finished sock a small white bundle in her lap, felt the words rise in her, pushed up by the intimacy of the firelit silence and the gift of the rattle. She spoke softly, her voice barely louder than the flames, her eyes fixed on the dancing light. They called me gluttonous. In town. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Said my appetites had brought this situation upon me. She could feel Orson go perfectly still. The leather in his hands was forgotten. They said no decent man would have me. That I was unlovable in this state. Her hand rested on the curve of her belly, a habit of protection. They saw the child as a punishment, a burden to be borne. She risked a glance at him. He was looking at her, his gaze so intense it was almost a physical touch. There was no pity in his eyes. There was a deep, focused understanding, a listening that went deeper than words. He set the bridle down. Slowly, deliberately he raised his hand. He pointed a thick finger first at his own chest, then made a wide, encompassing gesture around the room, the sturdy walls, the warm fire, the jar of wildflowers. Finally, his gaze locked with hers, he pointed directly at her. The meaning was as clear as if he had shouted it. My home was empty. You filled it. The tears that came then were not of sorrow or relief, but of a profound, staggering recognition. He had not just given her shelter. He had given her a purpose. He had not just tolerated her presence. He had declared it a blessing. In the grammar of their silent language, he had just spoken a sentence more beautiful than any poetry she had ever known. The wind outside screamed, but inside for the first time, Elara felt an unshakable calm. The storm could not touch them here. The spring sun grew stronger, warming the rough-hewn logs of the house and coaxing a faint green fuzz from the seemingly dead earth around the ranch. With a full belly and the relentless fear of homelessness soothed, Elara's body began to change. The sharp angles of hunger that had remained beneath the softness of her pregnancy filled out. A healthy color returned to her cheeks. The dark hollows under her eyes faded. The life within her seemed to kick with more vigor, as if it too felt the security of this strange sanctuary. One afternoon she decided to bring Orson his lunch in the high pasture. She packed a cloth with cold roast meat, thick slices of buttered bread, and a wedge of the dried apple pie he had eaten 2 slices of the night before with a look of near reverence. The walk was longer than she anticipated, the slope steeper. She paused often, one hand pressed into the small of her back, her breath coming in soft clouds. She crested a rise and saw him below, not working, but standing perfectly still by a fence post at the far edge of the pasture. He was looking at something. His massive shoulders, usually a picture of capable strength, were slumped. His head was bowed. There was an aura of such profound stillness about him that it felt heavier, sadder than any movement. Elara approached quietly, her footsteps muffled by the new grass. He didn't hear her. His entire focus was fixed on a simple, well-tended wooden cross that stood beneath the solitary shade of a gnarled pine tree. It was a quiet, lonely spot, with a view of the valley that was both breathtaking and desolate. She saw him then not as the giant, the rancher, her employer, but as a man. A man carrying a grief so immense it had carved hollows in his soul that matched the ones hunger had carved in her cheeks. He must have sensed her presence. He turned slowly. There were no tears on his face, but his eyes, those clear blue lakes, were stormy with a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. He looked from her face to the cross and back again, and the connection was as clear as if he'd spoken. This is why. He didn't shy away from her gaze. Instead, he turned fully towards her, his expression raw and open. He pointed a trembling finger at the cross. Then he fumbled at the neck of his shirt, pulling on a leather cord she had never noticed before. A simple, worn gold wedding ring slid into view. He held it in his palm, a tiny gleaming thing against his calloused skin. His story unfolded in a series of heartbreaking, silent gestures. He pointed to the ring, then to the cross. My wife. He made a cradling motion with his arms, rocking them gently. Then he pointed again to the cross. My child. He laid his head sideways upon his folded hands, closing his eyes. The universal sign for sleep, for death. They are gone. Finally, he brought his empty, cupped hands to his chest, and then opened them out towards the vast, empty landscape, his face a mask of utter desolation. And I am left with this. The wind sighed through the pine needles. Elara's own child stirred within her, a poignant, living counterpoint to the death he mourned. She understood everything now. The oversized, sterile house built for a family that never was. The silence that wasn't just a lack of speech, but a monument to a stolen future. His initial, hesitant acceptance of her, a pregnant woman, was not just kindness, it was a ghost reaching for a reflection. She didn't offer empty words. There were no words in any language that could fill a hole that deep. She didn't try to touch him, fearing the dam of his composure might break in a way that would shame him. Instead, she took a step forward until she stood beside him, her shoulder close to his arm. She looked at the cross, honoring the loss. Then she looked out at the same view he had been staring at, the sweeping valley, the defiant mountains, and she simply stood with him in his grief. After a long moment, she slowly reached out and placed her hand over his, the one that still clutched the fence post, its knuckles white. Her small, flour-dusted palm rested on his massive, weathered knuckles. It wasn't a grip, not a pull, just a weight. A warmth. A silent testament that said, you are not alone in this. I see your pain. I will hold this space with you. He shuddered, a great, racking tremor that went through his whole frame. He didn't pull his hand away. He turned it over, his palm facing upwards, and her hand slid into his. His fingers closed around hers with an incredible, heartbreaking gentleness. They stood there for a long time, the giant and the pregnant woman, hand in hand under the pine tree, the wind their only requiem, the past and the future held in a fragile, silent balance between them. The wound beneath the surface was now acknowledged, and in the acknowledging, it began just barely to heal. The peace they had woven, thread by silent thread, was shattered by the sound of an unfamiliar horse. Elara was in the herb garden, carefully transplanting seedlings she had nurtured on the windowsill. Orson was at the forge behind the barn, the steady rhythmic clang of his hammer shaping a new shoe for the plow horse. It was a symphony of domesticity, a bubble of hard-won contentment. The sound of the horse's trot was too quick, too purposeful for a neighborly visit. There were no neighbors. Orson's hammer fell silent. Elara straightened up, wiping her earthy hands on her apron, a cold dread pooling in her stomach even before she saw the rider. She didn't need to see his face. She knew the cut of his coat, the rigid set of his shoulders. It was the town preacher. He reined in his horse at the gate, not bothering to dismount, his eyes scanning the property like a surveyor assessing condemned land. His gaze swept over the now tidy yard, the tended garden, and finally landed on Elara, standing defensively in front of her fledgling plants. Orson emerged from the shadow of the barn, his large form a sudden, solid presence at the edge of the yard. He didn't move, but his stillness was more threatening than any advance. The hammer was still in his hand. The preacher's eyes flickered from Elara's swollen belly to the giant by the barn, and his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. He nudged his horse forward a few steps, stopping a safe distance from Orson. "Elara Miller?" he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. "We heard you'd taken refuge out here." With him. The pause before him was a masterpiece of condemnation. It reduced Orson to a thing, an animal, a rumor. Elara felt a hot flush of anger rise up her neck. She walked toward the porch, wanting the slight elevation it offered, wanting to stand her ground. Orson moved almost imperceptibly, shifting his weight to position himself between the preacher and the house. "I have," Elara said, her voice clearer and steadier than she felt. "I am his cook." The preacher's smile was a cold, mirthless thing. A precarious situation for an unwed mother. This arrangement. He said the word as if it were something filthy, is unseemly. The town is talking. It reflects poorly on us all. Orson took one slow, heavy step forward. The preacher's horse skittered sideways, nervous. "The town has done its talking," Elara replied, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "And it has done its casting out. I have no business with the town anymore." "Come back," the preacher said, his tone shifting to a wheedling, false kindness that was more insulting than his open disdain. "We will find you Christian charity. A place in the parish house. You need not live in sin and squalor with a mute brute." That was the spark to the tinder. Orson flinched as if struck. The word brute hung in the air, and Elara saw the old wound in his eyes open wide. The lifetime of being seen as less than human, a force of nature to be feared, not a man to be known. But before Orson could react, Elara's voice rang out, sharp and cold as a shard of ice. "You will not speak of him that way on his own land." The preacher blinked, startled by her ferocity. "You speak of Christian charity," she continued, advancing to the top step of the porch. "But I have found more of it in this man's silence than in all the shouted sermons in your church. He has given me a home, not a judgment. He has given me work, not pity. You offer me a place to hide my shame, while he has offered me a place to build a life." She was trembling now, but with a righteous fury that made her feel 10 feet tall. "You can tell the town that this arrangement is the most Christian thing that has ever happened to me. Now you will leave." The preacher's face tightened, his mask of piety crumbling into pure spite. His eyes, narrowed and venomous, locked on Orson, who had remained a silent, looming sentinel. "Preacher, is he even a man? Or just a beast of burden? Can he even speak for himself? Can he defend his own honor, or does he need a pregnant woman to do it for him?" The taunt was meant to provoke, to emasculate. Orson's knuckles were white around the handle of the hammer. A low, guttural sound, the precursor to a roar that had been trapped for years, rumbled in his chest. But Elara was faster. She descended the steps and walked right up to the preacher's horse, looking up at him without a trace of fear. "He speaks," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm, "in the food he puts on my table. He speaks in the roof he mended over my head. He speaks in the safety he provides. He speaks more clearly in his silence than you do with all your scripture. Now, get this land." For a long moment, the preacher stared down at her, his jaw working. He looked from her defiant face to Orson's terrifying stillness. He saw he had lost. He yanked hard on the reins, pulling his horse around. "This is not over," he spat, but the words were hollow, lost in the dust kicked up by his horse's hooves as he rode back toward the gate. Elara stood watching until he was a speck on the horizon. Only then did the strength drain from her legs. She leaned against the porch post, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Orson was at her side in an instant. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a shelter. He looked down at her, his eyes no longer wounded, but filled with an awe so profound it was almost worship. He pointed to his own chest, then to her, and then made a fist, holding it over his heart. "You defended me." Tears finally welled in Elara's eyes, not of fear but of fierce, protective love. She had faced down the dragon of her past, not for herself but for him. And in doing so, their silent treaty had been forged into something unbreakable. They had faced the world and they had stood together. The preacher's visit left a residue, a thin film of dread that the next wind would bring more than just dust. But the next wind brought a deep, unnatural cold, and by afternoon, the sky was the color of bruised lead. The first flakes of snow swirled, hesitant at first, then with a gathering fury. By nightfall, the world outside the windows had vanished, replaced by a howling, white void. The blizzard had come, locking them in a frozen, sound-muffled tomb. Elara tried to maintain the evening's routine, stoking the fire, preparing a simple stew. But a different, deeper storm was gathering within her. A low, persistent ache had taken root in her back, a dull throb that echoed the rhythm of the wind. She dismissed it as the strain of the day, the unyielding pressure of the child. She sat by the fire, picking up her knitting, but her fingers were clumsy, the stitches uneven. The first real pain struck like a lightning bolt, a sharp, twisting cramp that stole her breath. She dropped the knitting, her hands flying to her belly. A small, sharp cry escaped her. Orson, who had been sharpening a tool by the fire, froze. His head came up, his eyes wide and alert. "Elara, it's nothing. Just the weather." She tried to smile, to wave him off, but another pain, closer this time, ripped the pretense away. She doubled over, a guttural moan tearing from her throat. That was all Orson needed. He was on his feet in an instant, the tool forgotten. The calm, capable giant was gone, replaced by a creature of pure, frantic instinct. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for an enemy to fight, a problem he could solve with his hands. But this was a battle no hammer or saw could win. Elara's labor was a relentless tide. The waves of pain came faster, harder, pulling her under into a primal sea of agony. She lost all sense of time, of place. There was only the firelight, the roar of the storm, and the crushing pressure. Through the haze she was aware of him. A massive, trembling presence. He brought kettles of water to boil, his hands shaking so badly the water sloshed onto the hot stove, hissing into steam. He piled more wood on the fire until the room was sweltering, a tropical cave in the heart of the ice. He laid out clean linens on the table, his movements clumsy, his size a hindrance in the delicate, terrifying theater of birth. During a brief, excruciating lull she saw his face. He was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked more terrified than she felt. He was back at that lonely cross under the pine tree, watching history prepare to repeat its cruelest trick. Elara, gasping, "No, Orson, look at me." He forced his eyes to hers, his breath coming in ragged pants. "Elara, this is different. You are here." A particularly violent contraction seized her, and she screamed, her body arching off the bed they had prepared. Instinctively her hand shot out, searching for an anchor. It found his. She gripped his hand with a strength that belied her exhaustion, her nails digging into his palm. It was the same hand that could split a log with a single blow, that could gentle a spooked horse, that had carved a rattle for a child not his own. And he did not pull away. He let her crush his fingers, his own grip firm, steadying, a rock in her torrential pain. He was there, mopping her brow with a cool cloth, his touch impossibly gentle. He was there, holding a cup of water to her lips when she could manage a sip. He was there, a silent pillar in the storm, his eyes never leaving her face, pouring all his will, his hope, his silent, fierce love into her, becoming her strength when her own was gone. The night wore on, an eternity of pain and firelight. And then, as a pale, weak dawn began to bleed through the swirling snow at the windows, the final, monumental push came. Elara's world narrowed to a single burning point of effort, a scream torn from the depths of her soul. And then a new sound. A thin, indignant and wonderfully healthy cry pierced the air. It was a sound of life, fierce and vibrant, cutting through the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. Silence. The only sound was the baby's furious wails and Elara's ragged, sobbing breaths. Orson stood frozen, his hands still locked in hers, his eyes wide with a terror and awe so profound he seemed to have stopped breathing. He watched as Elara, with trembling, reverent hands, gathered the squirming, bloody infant to her chest. Exhausted, radiant, she looked down at her daughter. Then her eyes, full of a love that eclipsed all the pain, found his. He took a hesitant step closer, then slowly, carefully knelt by the bed. He was so large he had to bow his head. He stared at the baby, at the tiny, perfect fingers, the squalling mouth, the dark, wet hair. He was utterly captivated, a man witnessing a miracle. Tears, unchecked and silent, streamed down his face, cutting tracks through the dust and sweat. He reached out a single, enormous, calloused finger, as if to touch something more precious than anything in the world. The baby's flailing hand, no bigger than a walnut, bumped against his finger. And then, by some instinct, her tiny fingers curled, wrapping tightly around it. The giant's breath hitched. A sob, long trapped, broke free from his chest. He did not pull away. He stayed there, on his knees, his finger held fast in the grip of the new life he had helped usher into the world. Elara smiled, her own tears falling onto the baby's head. Elara whispering, "Her name is Grace." Orson looked from the baby, Grace, to Elara. He nodded, a world of meaning, of promise, of a healed and hopeful future, contained in that single tear-soaked gesture. The storm outside was already beginning to fade, and in its place the warm, defiant sound of a newborn's cry filled the house, a declaration that life and love had won. Spring did not come to the valley so much as it conquered it. The snow retreated, revealing earth dark and rich, and the world exploded in a riot of green and wildflower gold. Inside the ranch house, a different kind of blossoming was underway. Elara stood at the porch rail, the sun warm on her face. Grace, now several months old, was a warm, solid weight in the crook of her arm, gurgling at a passing butterfly. Elara's body, once a source of shame and hardship, felt different to her now. The softness of her belly was a pillow for her daughter's head. The fullness of her hips and breasts were the very architecture of nurture. She was no longer the starved, desperate woman who had stumbled to this gate. She was rooted, strong, her figure that of a life-giver, a sustainer. The rhythmic scrape-scrape of a draw knife was the music of the morning. Orson was a few feet away, his massive frame bent over a new project. It was a rocking chair, but unlike the oversized furniture inside, this one was being crafted to Elara's proportions. His hands, which could break a man in two, guided the tool with an artist's patience, shaving long, fragrant curls of pine from the wood. Each stroke was measured, deliberate, an act of devotion. He paused, running a palm over the smooth curve of the arm. He looked at her, then at the chair, and signed with his free hand, his brow furrowed in a question. "Is it good?" "Elara, it's perfect, Orson." Her voice was soft, laced with a contentment so deep it felt like a fundamental truth. She looked out over their land, the thriving herb garden, the repaired corral, the distant cross under the pine tree that no longer spoke only of grief, but also of the love that had dared to grow in its shadow. The memory of the preacher's words, which had once felt like brands seared into her soul, now seemed as distant and insignificant as last winter's snow. They belonged to a different woman, a ghost. "Elara, they were wrong, you know." Orson set his draw-knife down, giving her his full attention, his blue eyes clear and steady. "Elara, about my weight. All my life I was told it made me less. Unlovable. An object of pity or scorn." She shifted Grace to her other hip, her gaze unwavering. "Elara, but they had it backwards. It was never a barrier to love." She looked down at her daughter, then back at him, a slow, sure smile spreading across her face. "Elara, it was just more of me to love with. More to give to her. More strength to build a life here with you." The words hung in the spring air, a final, gentle laying down of a burden she had carried for a lifetime. Orson did not need words to reply. He rose from his work and came to her, his movements as quiet and sure as the changing seasons. He didn't try to embrace her, not with the baby between them. Instead, he sat on the porch steps beside her chair, his bulk so immense the wood creaked a familiar, comforting complaint. He looked at her, his love for her shining so plainly in his face it was like a physical warmth. Then he did what he always did. He spoke in the language they had built. He placed his hand, the one that had held hers through the storm of birth, firmly over his own heart. He held it there for a long moment, feeling the beat. Then he pointed directly at her, and then to the baby in her arms. "My love is here. It lives in you. It lives in her." It was the most profound declaration she had ever received. Elara reached out and laid her hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid, dependable strength of him. She rested her head against his arm, and they sat there together, watching the new day unfold over the land they had made a home. The giant, the mother, and the child. A family bound not by blood, but by choice, by silence, and by the profound, nourishing warmth they had built together in the heart of the wilderness. The weight of winter was gone, and in its place was only the immeasurable anchoring weight of love.